Before we begin, comment where you're watching from and the time on your clock, not for engagement, but for record keeping. In cases like this, patterns only become visible when details are compared across distance and time. I discovered this case while reviewing routine municipal supply ledgers from the late 19th century, documents meant to fade into storage, and what caught my attention wasn't an accusation or a witness, but a set of numbers that never changed. In the spring of 1899, an orphan house operating on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city was formally declared empty following a brief administrative review, its wards listed as transferred, discharged, or otherwise accounted for. Yet the meal orders placed with the same regional wholesaler continued at the exact same quantities for more than a year afterward. At first glance, this appears to be a clerical oversight, the sort of minor error that accumulates in any large bureaucracy. But the more I traced the paper trail, the more deliberate the continuity appeared. The quantities did not fluctuate, the delivery dates remained consistent, and the invoices were paid promptly from the same account without dispute or inquiry, as though the institution continued to function exactly as before, minus the people it was said to house. The orphan house itself had been established decades earlier as a charitable institution. Its stated purpose, the care and education of children deemed dependent by the county, and by the late 1890s, it occupied a modest complex of brick buildings set back from the main road, close enough to receive deliveries, but far enough removed to avoid casual oversight. According to the annual reports filed with the county board, occupancy had declined steadily in the years leading up to 1899 due to changes in placement policy and the growing preference for family boarding arrangements, a trend that was not unusual for the period. The Declaration of Emptiness, dated March 14 of that year, reads as a formality rather than an event, a brief notation entered between maintenance expenditures and staffing adjustments, stating simply that no wards remained on the premises as of that date. What followed should have been administrative contraction, reduced orders, staff layoffs, and eventual closure or repurposing of the site. Yet none of that appears in the records. Instead, the supply ledger for April shows the same weekly orders for bread, meat, dairy, and staples that had been placed when the house was full, and the pattern continues without interruption. I confirmed this continuity by cross-referencing invoices, delivery receipts, and payment stubs, all bearing the same institutional stamp and all signed by the same clerk whose handwriting remains consistent throughout. There is no marginal note indicating error, no corrective adjustment, no reimbursement or refund, and no correspondence questioning the necessity of the deliveries. When I examined the minutes of the county board meetings for that summer, I found no discussion of the orphan house beyond a brief acknowledgement that its status had been reviewed and required no further action. That phrase appears again and again in similar contexts across different cases, and it is often the moment when a file effectively goes cold. The wholesaler's records, preserved in a separate archive, confirmed that deliveries continued on schedule, with drivers noting the same drop-off location and the same acceptance procedure, though they make no mention of who received the goods beyond the customary initials. One driver's route log includes a brief aside, months later, remarking that the stop was quiet, which in itself is unremarkable, but the absence of any note about a change in status is striking. As I reconstructed the institutional workflow, it became clear that the orphan house occupied a peculiar position within the county's administrative structure, funded through a combination of charitable endowment and public subsidy, overseen nominally by a board that met infrequently and relied heavily on reports prepared by the very staff whose activities they were meant to review. The Declaration of Emptiness did not trigger an inspection or audit. It triggered nothing at all beyond the continuation of routine. Letters from the period, sparse as they are, suggest that the closure was understood as temporary, though no reopening date is ever specified, and temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent when no one is tasked with revisiting them. I visited the site decades later, long after the buildings had been repurposed and partially demolished, and what remains aligns with the records in an unsettling way. a set of foundations and service corridors that suggest sustained use beyond the date at which official occupancy ended. In the archive, I located a maintenance invoice from late 1899 authorizing repairs to the kitchen range and the replacement of worn benches in the dining area, expenditures that make little sense if no meals were being prepared. The invoice is approved without comment, filed alongside others, and never referenced again. When patterns like this appear, the temptation is to reach for extraordinary explanations, but the documents themselves point toward something more prosaic and, in some ways, more disturbing. A system that continued to feed a function that no longer officially existed because acknowledging the discrepancy would have required attention, responsibility, and perhaps accountability. The meal orders became a kind of metronome, marking time in a building that was said to be empty, and as I followed them forward month by month, I began to see how silence and routine can conspire to preserve a fiction long after it has ceased to be plausible. If you are still with me, note the dates as they pass. Because what happens next is not a sudden revelation, but an accumulation, and it is in that accumulation that the true shape of this case begins to emerge. As the months following the declaration passed, the paper trail did not thin in the way one would expect from a dormant institution. Instead, it thickened, accumulating the quiet residue of routine transactions that, when viewed individually, appear harmless, even reassuring, but together form a record of persistence that is difficult to reconcile with the official narrative. I began part 2 of this reconstruction by mapping the supply orders against other operational documents, aligning delivery dates with staffing rosters, maintenance requests, and utility payments. And what emerged was not a picture of gradual shutdown, but of steady maintenance, as though the orphan house had slipped into a category of existence that was neither active nor closed, a kind of administrative afterlife sustained by habit. The staffing records are particularly revealing in this regard. While the annual report lists all caregiving positions as terminated or reassigned by mid-March of 1899, the payroll ledger maintained by the county treasurer shows continued payments to a reduced cadre of employees under the heading Custodial Services, a vague designation that covers a multitude of functions and requires little scrutiny. These payments are modest but regular, issued biweekly, and endorsed by the same signatures that appear on earlier rolls. There is no notation indicating that these employees were present only intermittently or for limited duties. The ledger treats their employment as ongoing and unremarkable. When I traced those names into census supplements and city directories, I found that several continued to list their address as the orphan house well into the following year, a detail that conflicts directly with the assertion that the building stood empty. Census records from this period are often imprecise, but the repetition of the address across multiple entries suggests continuity rather than error. I located a letter dated June 1899 from a local supplier of coal requesting clarification on delivery quantities, noting that the previous winter's usage had not declined despite the reported absence of residents. The response, a brief note penned on institutional letterhead, assures the supplier that current orders are correct and should continue until further notice. There is no explanation, no acknowledgement of inconsistency, just an instruction to proceed. That phrase appears again in a different context later that year, in a memo from the county clerk responding to a query about the orphan house's status, stating that the matter had been reviewed and required no immediate action. In administrative language, immediate is a flexible term, one that can stretch indefinitely when no deadline is imposed. I reviewed the minutes of a site inspection purportedly conducted in August 1899, which concluded with the assessment that the property was secure and orderly. The report is brief, lacking detail, and notably omits any mention of interior spaces beyond a general assurance that all appeared in order. The inspector's name appears on dozens of similar reports from that summer, suggesting a cursory process driven by volume rather than depth. What troubled me most was the consistency of the meal orders themselves. The quantities correspond precisely to a full complement of residents, including allowances for staff and do not reflect seasonal variation or attempts at economizing. Bread is ordered daily, meat several times a week, milk in quantities that would spoil if unused, and fresh produce on a schedule that presumes immediate consumption. Waste would have been obvious, yet no waste is recorded, no complaints filed, and no adjustments made. The wholesaler's payment records show no credits issued for returned goods, and the orphan house's account remains balanced. This suggests that the food was being consumed or at least distributed in a way that satisfied both parties enough to avoid questions. I attempted to locate correspondence from the charitable board responsible for oversight, but the file from that year is conspicuously thin, containing only routine acknowledgments and a single letter congratulating the institution on its efficient handling of the transition. Efficient handling of what remains unclear. The absence of inquiry is itself a form of action, one that allows anomalies to persist unchallenged. In September, a maintenance request authorizes the repair of dormitory windows damaged by a storm, specifying the upper floor of the east wing, a space that would have had no function if the house were empty. The repair is completed, invoiced, and paid, and the windows appear again in a photograph taken years later, intact and in use. When I compare this case to others from the same period, a pattern emerges of institutions declared empty or closed on paper while continuing limited operations off the books, often justified by transitional language that never resolves into a final state. In most cases, however, the scale diminishes quickly, orders taper off, and staff disperse. Here, the scale remains constant. The explanation offered informally by later administrators, when pressed decades afterward, is that the institution was in a holding pattern pending reorganization, but no reorganization plan exists in the files, and no timeline is ever articulated. Holding patterns require active oversight to remain temporary. Without it, they become permanent by default. I visited the local historical society to review oral histories collected in the mid-20th century, and while none mention the orphan house directly, several recall deliveries to a quiet building at the edge of town, a place that was said to be closed but never fully abandoned. These recollections are vague, colored by time, and cannot be treated as evidence on their own, yet they align with the documentary record in a way that reinforces rather than contradicts it. By the end of 1899, the orphan house exists in two states simultaneously, empty by declaration and active by operation, sustained by routine transactions that no one appears motivated to reconcile. This duality sets the stage for what follows in the new year, when the gap between paper and practice begins to attract attention not because of concern for those who might still be present, but because of the strain it places on administrative fiction. Before we move forward, take note of how long this situation has persisted without comment, because the length of time matters, and it will shape the responses that come next. By the beginning of 1900, the orphan house had outlasted the language that was meant to explain it, and this is the point at which the records begin to show strain, not in the form of alarm, but in the subtle adjustments institutions make when a story no longer aligns cleanly with its paperwork. The meal orders continue unchanged into January, but now they are accompanied by small procedural annotations, marks that suggest awareness without confrontation. One invoice includes a penciled check beside the quantity column, as if someone paused long enough to notice the number before approving it anyway. Another bears a stamped receipt, dated a day later than usual, a minor delay that hints at hesitation. These are not objections. They are the bureaucratic equivalent of a glance over the shoulder, brief and quickly corrected. I found the first explicit acknowledgement of discrepancy in a letter dated February 3, 1900, from a junior clerk in the county supply office to his supervisor, asking whether the standing orders for the orphan house should be reviewed given its current status. The reply, written in a firm but economical hand, instructs him to leave existing arrangements in place until directed otherwise. No reason is given, and none is requested. The exchange is filed, not escalated. This is how institutions preserve continuity in the face of uncertainty, by deferring responsibility upward while ensuring nothing changes at the operational level. The effect is a kind of administrative inertia that becomes harder to overcome with each passing week. Around this time, utility records show a consistent pattern of water and gas usage at the site, not high enough to indicate full occupancy, but too steady to suggest vacancy. The figures rise and fall within a narrow range, implying routine, daily activity rather than sporadic maintenance visits. When I charted these numbers against seasonal norms, they matched the profile of a building in use, albeit quietly. A caretaker could explain some of this, but the scale exceeds what one or two individuals would require, particularly when combined with the unchanged food deliveries. In March, a brief inspection report notes that the kitchen facilities are in good working order and that stores are adequately maintained. The report does not state why the kitchen is being inspected at all, nor does it reconcile this with the house's declared emptiness. It simply records the condition and moves on. What becomes increasingly clear is that the orphan house is being managed as a space of exception, governed by rules that no longer require explicit justification. This is reinforced by the way questions are handled. When a local charity representative requests clarification on the institution's status for inclusion in an annual directory, the response he receives describes the house as temporarily inactive, a term that appears nowhere else in the documentation and is never defined. Temporarily inactive allows for continued expenditure without the moral or legal implications of active care, and it allows for the absence of oversight that would accompany a formally operating facility. It is a word chosen for its flexibility. I searched for records of the children who were said to have been transferred out in March of the previous year, hoping to trace placements and confirm that the declaration of emptiness corresponded to actual movement. The placement logs are incomplete. Several names appear without destinations. Others list receiving institutions that, when checked, have no record of the arrivals. This does not prove that the children remained at the orphan house, but it complicates the assertion that they left. In the margin of one placement ledger, a note reads, "Accounted for," with no further detail. Accounted for is another phrase that closes a file without opening it. As spring approaches, the meal orders continue to arrive on schedule, and now they are joined by requisitions for clothing and bedding repairs, modest requests that would make little sense in a truly empty building. These requisitions are approved, fulfilled, and paid, their existence acknowledged nowhere beyond the ledger. No one compiles them into a narrative. They exist as isolated confirmations of continuity. I attempted to locate correspondence from the orphan house itself during this period, letters that might have explained or at least described daily operations, but the outgoing mail file from late 1899 through mid-1900 is missing entirely. It is not marked as destroyed or transferred. It simply stops. Incoming correspondence, however, continues, including routine notices and invoices that assume an active recipient. The absence of outgoing explanation, paired with the presence of incoming assumption, creates an informational vacuum that allows the fiction to persist unchallenged. In June, a county auditor conducts a general review of institutional expenditures and notes that the orphan house's budget line shows no reduction despite its reported closure. His comment, recorded in the audit summary, suggests that the matter be reviewed at a later date. Later dates are a recurring theme. When I examined the board minutes from the following meeting, the auditor's comment was acknowledged, but tabled, deferred to a subcommittee that never files a report. This is not negligence in the dramatic sense. It is a slow diffusion of responsibility across layers of process until no single person feels authorized to act. The orphan house continues to receive supplies, continues to consume utilities, continues to require maintenance, and continues to exist as a functional space without a functional explanation. By the end of the summer of 1900, the discrepancy has persisted for more than 18 months, long enough that correcting it would require not only administrative effort, but also an admission that the initial declaration was incomplete or false. Institutions rarely volunteer such admissions unless compelled. Instead, They normalize the anomaly. In this normalization, the most important question shifts from why the meal orders never changed to why no one insisted they should. As we move into the next phase of this investigation, attention turns from routine persistence to the moments when the anomaly begins to generate quiet discomfort among those tasked with maintaining the fiction, discomfort that will surface not as protest, but as subtle attempts to distance themselves from responsibility. By the autumn of 1900, the orphan house had become something administrators did not discuss unless prompted, and even then, only in the narrowest terms, a strategy that appears repeatedly in institutional histories when an unresolved condition persists long enough to feel permanent. The records from this period show a shift in tone, subtle but consistent, as if those involved were no longer trying to explain the situation, but to insulate themselves from it. The first indication of this shift appears in the way documents are signed. Earlier invoices and approvals bear full signatures, clear and legible, asserting responsibility. Beginning in September, initials replace names, and in some cases, even those are absent, replaced by stamps or pre-printed authorizations. This is not uncommon in busy offices, but the timing is notable, coinciding with the point at which the discrepancy between declared emptiness and operational continuity had become undeniable. When responsibility diffuses, accountability follows. I traced one set of initials to a clerk who had recently transferred into the supply office from a different department, someone unlikely to have been present during the original declaration of emptiness. Her initials appear repeatedly on orphan house documents for several months, suggesting that the task had been reassigned to someone with no historical context, a common method of reducing institutional memory. Without memory, there can be no contradiction. Around this time, the language used to describe the orphan house in internal memos becomes increasingly abstract. Where earlier documents referred to wards, residents, or staff, later ones speak only of the property, the facility, or the account. The human element recedes, replaced by asset management terminology that treats the building as a logistical node rather than a place of care. This linguistic shift matters because it reframes the anomaly as a matter of inventory rather than welfare, making it easier to ignore the implications of sustained provisioning. In October, a fire safety inspection is scheduled, prompted by a new county ordinance requiring annual checks of all publicly funded buildings. The inspection report notes that exits are clear, fire buckets are filled, and kitchen equipment is properly maintained. The inspector does not comment on the absence or presence of occupants. His mandate is limited to safety compliance, and he fulfills it without deviation. The report includes a checkbox labeled Occupancy Status, which is marked as not applicable, a curious choice that sidesteps the question entirely. When I compared this report to others from the same inspection cycle, I found that not applicable appears only in cases where a building status is contested or transitional, a bureaucratic placeholder that allows the inspection to proceed without forcing a resolution. The meal orders continue, unchanged, through the winter months, even as other institutions reduce expenditures in response to budget tightening. The orphan house's account remains insulated, protected by the inertia of precedent. In January of 1901, a new county commissioner takes office and requests briefings on outstanding issues. Among the materials prepared for him is a summary of institutional assets, including the orphan house, described again as temporarily inactive. No mention is made of ongoing costs beyond a single line, noting routine maintenance and supplies. The summary does not invite questions. It answers them in advance by framing the situation as settled. When the commissioner visits several county properties that spring, the orphan house is not included in the itinerary. Travel logs show that the route would have required only a minor detour, but the omission is telling. It is easier to manage fiction at a distance. I found a letter from a local newspaper editor, written in March 1901, asking the county to confirm rumors that the orphan house might reopen or be repurposed. The response he receives is brief and non-committal, stating that no changes are planned at this time. The article that follows reports this statement without comment, effectively closing the public conversation. Silence is maintained not by secrecy, but by bland reassurance. The most striking document from this period is a requisition for replacement cookware submitted in April 1901. The items listed are specific and numerous, suggesting active use rather than storage. The requisition is approved swiftly, without question. When I examined the vendor's delivery confirmation, I noticed that it includes a note indicating that access was granted by a familiar face, a phrase that implies continuity of personnel. The vendor does not elaborate, and no follow-up occurs. At this stage, the anomaly has become normalized within the system, absorbed into daily operations. It no longer triggers hesitation, it triggers avoidance. This is the phase in which institutions are most resistant to correction, because the cost of acknowledging the problem now includes admitting that it has been allowed to persist. The orphan house, still declared empty on paper, continues to function as a site of routine activity, sustained by supply chains and maintenance cycles that no one has the incentive to interrupt. What is missing from the record is any attempt to reconcile these facts, any effort to align declaration with practice. Instead, we see a pattern of administrative distancing, where tasks are reassigned, language is softened, and oversight is narrowed to prevent uncomfortable questions. As we move forward, the focus shifts from how the system sustained this contradiction to how it responded when external pressures began to threaten the stability of the fiction, pressures that would force choices revealing the institution's true priorities. The first pressure that threatened to disturb the arrangement did not come from moral inquiry or public concern, but from accounting reform. In mid-1901, the county adopted a revised auditing procedure intended to standardize how funds were tracked across departments, a measure driven by efficiency rather than oversight. The reform required that each account be accompanied by a brief justification describing its current operational status, a summary meant to reduce ambiguity. For most institutions, this was a routine clerical task. For the orphan house, it posed a problem that could not be solved with a stamp or an initial. The justification drafted for that account is unusually long compared to others, filled with qualifying language that attempts to reconcile conflicting realities without naming them. It describes the property as inactive for residential purposes, but active for custodial maintenance, a distinction that appears nowhere else in the audit materials. This phrasing is carefully chosen, creating a category flexible enough to encompass ongoing provisioning without implying occupancy. The auditor reviewing the document adds a marginal note requesting clarification on the scope of maintenance. The response, written in a different hand, states simply that the current arrangement reflects historical practice and should not be altered without further review. No such review is scheduled. This exchange marks the first time the contradiction surfaces explicitly in the record, and the system's response is instructive. Rather than resolve the inconsistency, the institution defers it, pushing the question into an undefined future. This is a common bureaucratic maneuver, one that transforms a problem into a pending issue and then allows it to languish until it loses urgency. In the months that follow, other signs of strain appear. A supplier notes that payment for several deliveries has been delayed beyond the usual window, prompting a reminder letter. The delay is resolved quickly, but the letter itself is filed, a small indicator that the routine flow of resources has begun to attract attention. Around the same time, a maintenance request is submitted for repairs to the kitchen's ventilation system, citing wear inconsistent with non-use. The request is approved, but the description of the issue is edited in the final copy, replacing references to daily operation with language about deterioration over time. These edits suggest an awareness of scrutiny and a desire to preempt it by aligning documentation with the official narrative. What emerges is a picture of an institution actively managing its own paper trail, adjusting language and procedure to maintain coherence. In August 1901, a state-level inspection is announced, part of a broader review of publicly funded facilities. The inspection team's mandate is limited, focusing on structural integrity and fiscal compliance rather than programmatic outcomes. Still, the prospect of outside observers introduces risk. Preparations for the inspection include a flurry of internal correspondence, much of it concerned with ensuring that the orphan house's status is presented consistently. One memo instructs staff to refer all inquiries to a designated contact, consolidating communication to prevent contradictory statements. Another advises that certain areas of the building are not relevant to the inspection and need not be accessed. The inspection itself passes without incident. The report notes that the property is secure, utilities are functional, and expenditures align with historical patterns. The inspectors accept the explanation of custodial maintenance without question, lacking both the mandate and the context to probe deeper. This outcome reinforces the effectiveness of the containment strategy. By framing the issue narrowly and controlling information flow, the institution avoids confrontation. The orphan house continues its quiet existence, sustained by habit and protected by procedural boundaries. Yet beneath this stability lies a growing tension. The longer the arrangement persists, the more difficult it becomes to justify, especially as staff turnover erodes informal understandings. New employees encounter the account without the benefit of inherited caution, and while they follow established procedures, they also ask questions, even if only in private. I found a handwritten note tucked into a ledger from late 1901, not part of any formal correspondence. It reads, almost as an aside, that the numbers do not make sense. The note is unsigned and never referenced again. Its presence suggests that awareness of the anomaly was not confined to leadership, but filtered down to those handling the details. Awareness, however, does not translate into action without authority, and authority in this case is diffuse. No single individual owns the problem, and so it remains collectively ignored. As the year turns, the orphan house's account rolls over seamlessly, its balance carried forward as if nothing were amiss. The declaration of emptiness remains unchanged, a line copied year after year without reconsideration. This persistence is not evidence of certainty, but of convenience. Changing the declaration would require explanation, and explanation would invite scrutiny. By leaving it untouched, the institution preserves equilibrium. The question, then, is not why the meal orders never changed, but why no one stopped them. The answer lies not in malice or mystery, but in the architecture of administrative systems designed to prioritize continuity over truth. As we move into the next phase, external events will begin to challenge this equilibrium in ways that internal processes could not, forcing decisions that reveal how far the institution is willing to go to preserve its chosen narrative. The equilibrium held until a change in the broader environment made sustained inattention untenable. In early 1902, a regional consolidation of charitable institutions was proposed, driven by economic pressures and shifting philosophies about centralized care. Smaller facilities were to be reviewed for closure, repurposing, or integration into larger systems. On paper, the orphan house was an obvious candidate for disposal. It was already listed as empty, its function nominally suspended. Yet the Consolidation Committee's initial survey flagged it for special handling, noting ongoing expenditures inconsistent with inactivity. This was the first time the contradiction was elevated beyond the county's internal mechanisms. The committee requested a comprehensive status report, including occupancy, history, asset condition, and projected costs. The request triggered a flurry of internal coordination that reveals much about how institutions behave when confronted by external scrutiny. Drafts of the report circulated with sections added and removed, language softened, and specifics generalized. Early versions included a brief acknowledgement that the facility continued to receive supplies for preservation purposes. Later versions omitted this detail, replacing it with broader statements about maintenance standards. The final report, submitted after several revisions, presents the orphan house as a dormant asset awaiting a decision, its costs framed as minimal and necessary. The committee accepts this characterization provisionally, but schedules a site visit to verify conditions. The announcement of the visit produces a rare deviation in routine. Meal orders for the month preceding the inspection are reduced slightly, not eliminated, but adjusted downward in a way that suggests performative alignment with declared emptiness. The adjustment is temporary. The following month's orders return to previous levels. This brief fluctuation is the only documented change in provisioning over the entire period, and its timing is telling. It suggests an awareness of optics, an attempt to synchronize practice with narrative just long enough to pass inspection. The site visit itself is carefully managed. The committee members tour selected areas, guided along predetermined routes. They observe clean kitchens, stocked pantries, and well-maintained sleeping quarters, all presented as evidence of readiness rather than use. The explanation offered is that maintaining full readiness ensures rapid reactivation if needed. This rationale is accepted without challenge. Readiness, like maintenance, is a flexible concept, capable of justifying almost any level of activity. After the visit, the committee defers a final decision, citing the need to prioritize larger facilities. The orphan house is effectively sidelined, its status unchanged. The consolidation effort moves on, leaving the anomaly intact. What changes, however, is the institutional awareness that the arrangement is fragile. The close call prompts a renewed emphasis on internal consistency. Correspondence from late 1902 shows increased attention to how the orphan house is described in all documents. A memo instructs staff to avoid unnecessary detail and to adhere strictly to approved language. The memo emphasizes that deviations, even well-intentioned ones, can create confusion. This is the language of risk management, not deception. The goal is to reduce variability, to ensure that the story remains coherent across contexts. At the same time, subtle signs of strain continue. A long-serving kitchen worker retires, and her replacement submits questions about inventory levels that exceed typical maintenance needs. Her supervisor advises her to follow established orders without modification. The exchange is brief, but it underscores the reliance on compliance to sustain the system. Individuals may notice inconsistencies, but their roles do not empower them to address them. The system depends on this separation between observation and authority. In early 1903, a minor incident tests this separation. A delivery truck breaks down en route, delaying a shipment. The delay prompts a flurry of calls from the orphan house, concerned about missed schedules. The calls are logged by the supplier, who notes their urgency. This urgency is inconsistent with non-occupancy, but the note remains isolated, never cross-referenced with other records. The incident reveals that whatever processes depend on these deliveries are time-sensitive, yet the system absorbs the signal without integrating it. Each piece of evidence exists in its own silo, incapable of triggering a holistic reassessment. By mid-year, the consolidation effort has stalled due to funding constraints and attention shifts elsewhere. The orphan house fades back into the background, its brief exposure leaving only faint traces in the archive. The meal orders continue, their regularity unbroken. What emerges from this phase is a clearer picture of institutional priorities. The goal is not to uncover truth, but to maintain stability. Anomalies are tolerated as long as they do not disrupt broader objectives. When they threaten to do so, they are managed through temporary adjustments and controlled narratives. The orphan house is not unique in this regard. It is simply a particularly clear example of how systems can sustain contradictions indefinitely when doing so is easier than resolving them. The question that remains is how long such arrangements can persist without consequence. History suggests that while institutions can defer reckoning for extended periods, they are vulnerable to moments when accumulated inconsistencies intersect with change. In the next phase, we will see how such a moment begins to take shape not through dramatic revelation, but through gradual erosion of the very mechanisms that have kept the anomaly contained. By 1904, the mechanisms that had sustained the contradiction were no longer actively reinforced. They simply persisted, operating on momentum rather than intent. This is often the most dangerous stage in any prolonged administrative irregularity because it creates the illusion of resolution without the substance. The orphan house account continued to roll forward, its entries copied from prior years with minimal revision. New clerks inherited old ledgers and treated them as settled facts. The declaration of emptiness, now several years old, acquired the authority of age. What had once been a provisional statement hardened into accepted truth, not because it was accurate, but because it had been repeated without challenge. At the same time, subtle changes in the surrounding context began to erode the conditions that made such repetition viable. Population shifts in the county increased demand for charitable services elsewhere, drawing attention to resource allocation. Questions arose about why certain accounts remained insulated while others faced reductions. The orphan house's budget, modest but consistent, stood out against a backdrop of austerity. In response, administrators began to justify its stability by pointing to its historical role and the cost of reactivation, arguments that relied on its latent utility rather than its actual use. This rhetorical shift is important. The orphan house was no longer merely maintained, it was preserved as potential. Potential is harder to audit than reality, and thus easier to defend. In 1905, a new treasurer undertook a review of long-standing accounts as part of a personal initiative to modernize record-keeping. His approach differed from his predecessors in one crucial respect. He cross-referenced expenditures with declared statuses, looking for mismatches. The orphan house immediately drew his attention. His notes, preserved in a personal notebook rather than official files, express confusion at the volume and regularity of food orders tied to an empty facility. He drafts a memorandum seeking clarification and circulates it among senior staff. The responses he receives are polite but evasive, emphasizing continuity and cautioning against precipitous changes. One response advises him that altering established arrangements can have unforeseen consequences, a phrase that functions as a warning without explanation. The treasurer does not pursue the matter further. His memorandum is never entered into the formal record. This episode illustrates how individual initiative can be neutralized by collective reticence. The system does not forbid inquiry. It absorbs and redirects it until it dissipates. Meanwhile, the physical condition of the orphan house remains remarkably consistent. Maintenance logs show routine upkeep, repairs performed promptly, and supplies replenished as needed. There is no sign of neglect that might accompany genuine abandonment. This consistency reinforces the internal narrative of readiness and justifies ongoing costs, yet it also deepens the mystery of purpose. Readiness for what, exactly, and for whom? The archive offers no answer, only the steady accumulation of routine actions. In late 1905, a small but telling change appears in the meal orders. The quantities shift slightly, reflecting adjustments in dietary guidelines issued by the state. These guidelines were intended for active institutions, suggesting that whoever placed the orders was attentive to evolving standards. This attentiveness implies engagement rather than inertia. It suggests that the orphan house's provisioning was not a mindless repetition, but an actively managed process. The distinction matters. Inertia could be explained by oversight. Active adjustment implies intent, yet the intent remains opaque, hidden behind layers of procedure. As years pass, the absence of any corrective action begins to shape behavior outside the institution as well. Vendors come to regard the orphan house account as reliable, if peculiar. Its payments are steady and its orders predictable. They do not question its status because doing so would complicate a stable relationship. The market, like the bureaucracy, rewards continuity. By 1906, references to the orphan house in public documents become rarer, not because it has been resolved, but because it has become invisible. Its emptiness is assumed, its activity unexamined. The silence surrounding it is not enforced. It is habitual. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case. There is no single moment of suppression, no dramatic decision to conceal. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of attention until the anomaly exists only at the margins of awareness. When something is consistently present yet officially absent, it occupies a liminal space that resists categorization. The orphan house becomes such a space, maintained but not acknowledged, functioning without recognition. As I traced these developments, I was struck by how familiar the pattern felt. Institutions often manage unresolved issues by allowing them to persist quietly, trusting that time will either erase them or render them irrelevant. In this case, time did neither. It merely layered new routines atop old ones, deepening the disconnect between record and reality. The question that emerges is not whether the system could have corrected itself, but whether it ever truly intended to. Correction would have required confronting the implications of sustained provisioning, implications that extend beyond bookkeeping into the realm of responsibility. As we approach the final years of this period, we see the first signs that external circumstances, rather than internal will, may force a reckoning. The stability that has protected the orphan house thus far is not immutable. It depends on conditions that are beginning to shift. The shift came not as an accusation or an investigation, but as a logistical necessity imposed by circumstances beyond the county's control. In 1907, a regional supply consolidation altered how food contracts were fulfilled, replacing local vendors with centralized distributors operating under stricter documentation requirements. This change was implemented gradually, but its implications for the orphan house were immediate. The new distributors required confirmation of consumption levels and delivery justification tied to active service populations. For the first time, the orphan house's account could not be sustained by routine alone. A form was introduced requiring the certifying officer to attest, in writing, to the number of individuals served. The form allowed for maintenance-only accounts, but those required separate authorization and periodic review. The orphan house did not fit cleanly into either category. The certifying officer, responsible for completing the form, hesitated, and that hesitation left a mark in the archive. The initial submission is returned incomplete, with a note requesting clarification. The clarification is delayed. During that delay, meal orders continue under the old system, but only temporarily. The old contracts are expiring, and there is no mechanism to renew them without compliance. Internal correspondence from this period reveals a palpable anxiety, not about exposure, but about interruption. The concern expressed repeatedly is that any disruption could create problems that would be difficult to manage. What those problems might be is never stated explicitly. Instead, the language remains abstract, referring to downstream effects and unintended consequences. This vagueness suggests that whatever depended on the continuity of supplies was understood implicitly, even if it could not be articulated formally. In response to the distributor's requirements, administrators explore alternative classifications. One proposal suggests reclassifying the orphan house as a training or storage facility, categories that would permit limited provisioning. Another suggests transferring its account temporarily to a different department. Each proposal is debated briefly and then set aside, deemed impractical or insufficiently justified. The clock, however, is running. By early summer, deliveries are missed. The absence is noted immediately. A series of urgent messages is sent requesting expedited resolution. The tone of these messages is markedly different from earlier correspondence. Where previous communications were procedural and measured, these are direct and insistent. They speak of schedules, expectations, and the necessity of continuity. The distributor responds that without proper authorization, no further deliveries can be made. The standoff reveals how dependent the arrangement had become on informal accommodation. When that accommodation is withdrawn, the system falters. Faced with this impasse, a decision is made that marks a turning point. A temporary authorization is issued under the maintenance-only category, allowing limited deliveries while a full review is conducted. The authorization specifies reduced quantities, sufficient only for preservation activities. This reduction is documented carefully, as if to signal compliance. Yet the impact of the reduction is not recorded anywhere else. There are no notes indicating how the change affected operations at the orphan house. The silence is conspicuous. If the supplies were truly only for maintenance, the reduction should have been inconsequential. If they were not, the consequences would have been significant. The archive offers no answer, only the absence of commentary. The review promised by the temporary authorization never materializes. The classification remains provisional, renewed quietly as needed. The quantities ordered gradually increase again, approaching previous levels, though never quite matching them. This partial restoration suggests a compromise, an attempt to balance external requirements with internal needs. It also indicates that the anomaly has adapted rather than resolved. The orphan house continues, altered but intact. This adaptation underscores a broader truth about institutional systems. They are resilient, not because they correct themselves, but because they evolve to accommodate constraints. The contradiction that defined the orphan house is no longer sustained by inertia alone. It is actively managed within new parameters. The question of emptiness remains officially answered, but the question of purpose grows more obscure. As centralized oversight increases, the space for informal arrangements narrows, yet the orphan house persists. It does so by occupying ever more ambiguous categories, slipping between definitions. This slipperiness is its defense. By the end of 1907, references to the orphan house in supply documents are fewer but more coded. Abbreviations replace names, and categories replace descriptions. The paper trail becomes harder to follow, not because it has ended, but because it has been deliberately simplified. Complexity invites inquiry. Simplicity deflects it. In this phase, the institution's priority is no longer to justify the arrangement, but to obscure it within normalized processes. The result is a thinner archive, one that records outcomes without context. This thinning is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that less documentation reduces risk. The orphan house, once sustained by abundant paperwork, is now protected by scarcity. As we move toward the later years, the consequences of this shift will become apparent, not through dramatic exposure, but through the gradual erasure of traceable evidence. By the time the paper trail thinned, the orphan house had ceased to exist as a problem in any formal sense, and had instead become an assumption embedded so deeply in routine that its origins no longer mattered. This is the stage at which institutional irregularities become most durable, because they are no longer defended or explained. They are simply inherited. Clerks entering service after 1908 encountered the orphan house account already normalized within revised classifications. They saw reduced descriptors, standardized codes, and figures that fit within acceptable ranges. Nothing in these documents invited curiosity. The contradiction between declared emptiness and sustained provisioning had been compressed into abstraction, rendered invisible by the language of compliance. What survived were numbers without narrative, transactions without explanation. This erasure did not eliminate the underlying reality. It merely detached it from accountability. The long-term effect of this detachment is visible in how later records treat the orphan house as a stable constant. Annual summaries listed alongside other facilities with no commentary. Budget forecasts project its costs forward without adjustment. There is no indication that anyone revisited the original declaration of emptiness or questioned its continued validity. The declaration persists because it is no longer perceived as a claim, it is a label. Labels endure even when circumstances change. During this period, the physical site of the orphan house undergoes subtle changes. Maintenance logs indicate repairs to systems that would not degrade rapidly in true disuse. Plumbing fixtures are serviced, heating systems inspected, and waste removal scheduled. These activities are consistent with occupancy, yet they are framed as preservation. Preservation becomes the catch-all justification, capable of encompassing any level of engagement. The distinction between preserving a building and sustaining a function blurs until it is meaningless. This blurring is mirrored in the language of correspondence, which avoids specifics and relies on generalities. When a question arises about waste disposal frequency, the response cites standard practice without elaboration. When energy consumption is reviewed, it is deemed within acceptable variance. Each individual data point is defensible in isolation. Taken together, they suggest continuity of use. Yet no mechanism exists to aggregate these signals into a coherent assessment. The system is not designed to synthesize, only to process. In 1910, a minor clerical error offers a brief glimpse into what has been lost. A ledger entry mistakenly assigns the orphan house's monthly food expenditure to a different facility. The discrepancy is noticed quickly because it inflates that facility's budget beyond expectation. The correction restores the funds to the orphan house account without comment. What is notable is not the error, but the reaction. The correction is procedural, not investigative. No one asks why the orphan house expenditure exists, they only ensure it is correctly placed. This reflexive correction demonstrates how thoroughly the account has been normalized. The system reacts to anomalies in distribution, not in existence. Over time, the orphan house becomes a kind of institutional background noise, always present, never foregrounded. Its continued operation, whatever form that takes, is sustained by the same forces that sustain all routine processes: habit, compartmentalization, and the absence of incentives to disrupt. The archive reflects this with increasing silence. Where earlier years produced correspondence and marginal notes, later years offer only bare entries. The richness of the record diminishes as the system achieves equilibrium. This equilibrium, however, is fragile in its own way. It depends on continuity of personnel, of categories, of unexamined assumptions. When any of these change, the risk of exposure returns. Yet change does occur, and when it does, the lack of historical context makes it difficult to respond meaningfully. By the mid-1910s, shifts in social policy and charitable philosophy begin to render small, isolated institutions obsolete. Discussions emerge about consolidating care into centralized facilities with standardized oversight. The orphan house, still labeled empty, is technically unaffected by these discussions, but the infrastructure that sustains it is not. Supply networks evolve again, maintenance priorities shift, and funding models change. The orphan house's account persists through these changes, adjusted just enough to remain viable. It is neither closed nor activated. It is maintained in suspension. What is striking is how little resistance this state encounters. There are no protests, no debates, and no recorded objections. The absence of conflict suggests that whatever the orphan house represents has been successfully decoupled from public concern. It exists outside the realm of civic engagement, shielded by its classification. This decoupling has ethical implications. When an institution can sustain activity without recognition, it can also evade responsibility. The orphan house's sustained provisioning without declared occupants raises questions about who, if anyone, is being served and under what authority. Yet the archive offers no direct answer. It offers only the pattern: declared emptiness, unchanged orders, and thinning documentation. The meaning of that pattern is left to inference. As a researcher, this is the point at which speculation becomes tempting, but the discipline of the archive demands restraint. We can observe what happened, how it was managed, and what was omitted. We cannot fill the silence with certainty. What we can say is that the system succeeded in maintaining stability at the cost of transparency. The orphan house did not disappear. It faded into a category where its reality no longer mattered. This is perhaps the most unsettling outcome. Not that something anomalous persisted, but that it did so without provoking sustained inquiry. In the final phase of this case, we will look at how and when this suspended state eventually ended and what traces, if any, remained once the machinery that sustained it finally moved on. The end did not arrive with a revelation or a reckoning. It arrived the way these things almost always do, through administrative exhaustion. In 1917, a comprehensive restructuring of county-held properties was initiated in response to wartime pressures and shifting fiscal priorities. The mandate was broad and unsentimental. Identify assets that no longer served a clear public function and resolve them decisively. The process relied on summary lists rather than deep case reviews. Properties were grouped, categorized, and slated for disposition based on surface criteria. In this context, the orphan house finally became visible again, not as an anomaly, but as an inconvenience. Its continued appearance on expenditure reports triggered a straightforward question. Why was an empty property still costing money? Unlike previous inquiries, this one did not seek to preserve equilibrium. It sought closure. A directive was issued to terminate all non-essential maintenance accounts pending review. The orphan house was included. The directive is brief, almost curt, and it marks the first time in nearly 2 decades that provisioning is halted without a provisional substitute. There is no discussion, no attempt to reclassify or adapt. The machinery that had sustained the arrangement simply moves on. The final meal order is logged in early March. There is no notation indicating it as final. It is indistinguishable from those that came before. The following month, the ledger entry is blank. No explanation is provided. The silence is absolute. Subsequent records show the orphan house listed among properties transferred to a holding category pending sale or demolition. The language is final. The account is closed. What is striking is the absence of the aftermath. There are no reports of transition, no notes on impact, and no references to adjustments required elsewhere. Whatever depended on the continued flow of supplies is not documented. The archive ends the story where it began, with omission. Later, property records indicate that the building was sold at auction in 1921 to a private buyer who intended to repurpose the structure. Renovation permits were filed, but there is no evidence that the work was completed. By the late 1920s, the building no longer appears in tax rolls. A marginal note suggests it was dismantled, materials salvaged, and sold. The land changes hands several times over the decades. Nothing in those transactions references its prior function. By mid-century, the site is unremarkable. There is no marker, no mention in local histories. The orphan house is gone, not erased by catastrophe, but by disinterest. The meal orders, however, remain in the archive. They persist as a pattern without context, a sequence of numbers that resist explanation. When I first encountered them, I assumed they pointed toward a hidden occupancy or an unrecorded population. After tracing the case to its end, I am less certain. What they point to, more clearly, is a system capable of sustaining activity independent of meaning. The orders mattered not because of who consumed the meals, but because they fulfilled a procedural role. They maintained continuity, satisfied expectations, and avoided disruption. In that sense, the orphan house was less a place than a process, a node in a network that continued to function because stopping it would have required justification. This reframing does not resolve the discomfort the case generates. It deepens it. It suggests that harm and neglect do not always arise from intent, but from structures that prioritize stability over inquiry. The question of who, if anyone, benefited from those years of provisioning remains unanswered. The archive does not tell us, and speculation risks distorting what little evidence exists. What we can say is that the system never asked the question in a sustained way, and that failure is itself consequential. The declaration of emptiness was accepted because it was convenient. The unchanged orders were tolerated because they were routine. Together, they formed a contradiction that no one owned, and therefore no one resolved. This is the quiet horror at the center of the case. Not that something inexplicable happened in an orphan house at the turn of the century, but that an institution could operate for years without aligning its records with reality, and that this misalignment could persist without triggering accountability. When we think about past injustices, we often look for villains or dramatic acts. This case offers neither. It offers instead a portrait of bureaucratic inertia, of decisions deferred until they become invisible. The orphan house did not fail loudly. It faded softly, leaving behind a trail of paperwork that outlived its purpose. In the end, what remains is the pattern. A building declared empty, meal orders that never changed, a system that chose not to reconcile the two. If there is a lesson here, it is not about a single institution or era, but about the importance of attention. Records are not neutral. What is copied, what is questioned, and what is allowed to persist all shape outcomes. The act of documentation can be a form of care, but it can also be a means of avoidance. The difference lies in whether records are treated as living tools or as static artifacts. In this case, they were treated as the latter, and the cost of that choice is written in the gaps. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, cases where the paper trail tells a quieter but more troubling truth than any legend, consider subscribing. These records only matter if someone is willing to look at them, trace their patterns, and refuse to let administrative silence be the final word.